Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be showing you some quick tricks for pattern work. Now, for those of you in private pilot land, you've probably done these kind of things a million and one times, but for everyone else who's like, yeah, I wouldn't mind knowing a little bit more about that kind of magical run around the pattern stuff, what can you do to help? So first things first, one thing that I love to do is whenever I'm doing any sort of pattern work, is I like to set myself up a frame of reference that gives me the ability to quickly and accurately ascertain the direction of the runway. Now, depending on what device you're using, there's actually some really handy ways to display these on the screen. For us, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of the ability to do that other than actually coming to the zoom and making it a little bit bigger to make it more clear where the orientation of the screen and the map around us actually is. The second thing I really like to do is I actually like to set my heading bug, usually not to the actual runway, but to actually set my lovely little line here. This would be, my omni bearing selector to the direction of the runway itself. Now, the way you do this is relatively straightforward. If the thing you got to watch out for, though, is if you're in this particular aircraft here, and you're in our mode here that goes GPS, you have to actually set this to VOR1 or do one of the VOR options for the purposes of actually aligning this. Now, the thing you got to remember is whenever you're doing any work with this, that the runway heading might not necessarily correspond to the actual magnetic heading. A lot of people think if it's runway 24, it means it's exactly 240. So the trick here is if you actually set this while you're down on the ground, so you always have a reference for the direction of the runway itself, it's going to make things a lot easier for you. So now that that's all set, we'll go ahead and now get ourselves up into the pattern, and we'll take a look at some of the other quick tips that kind of work for me as well. Now, when you're working in small airports like this is up about Plymouth, which is not too bad. Been here a few times. Good little FBO. Used to have a restaurant, which is actually pretty cool. A couple things you want to be practicing whenever you're doing anything in the pattern. First of all, you want to make sure that you're doing all your rotations at the correct speed. You want to make sure whatever particular technique that you're working on is going to be at the correct speed. But the other thing you got to remember too is there's probably going to be other people in the pattern with you. Now, if it's a really lovely day, like the day that you see around us right now, you have to be insanely mindful of other traffic everywhere. There could be instrument traffic, there could be balloon traffic, helicopter traffic, and it all makes a big cascade of trouble. So the nice thing about that is when we know those things and we make our appropriate calls, we know that we're not going to run into a situation where we get in a bad spot. Now, many times have I actually worked in the pattern and actually stopped because of it. The next big trick here is once you get to your pattern altitude, reduce your power, please. That's the first thing that I tell you that I learned ages and ages ago. And it's one of those that, like, no matter how many times I've done it, it's always been like this little thing that makes such a difference as far as being able to get those patterns banged out nice and smoothly is getting your speed under control before you get to the part where you actually have to start landing the plane. Now, if you notice, I have a nice little map display there set to north up. You also notice I have that nice little indicator down there at the bottom, which is providing me with that critical piece of information I need, which is the orientation of the runway. Now, remember when you were first doing turns around a point way back in the day that it was outside-inside maneuvers, kind of a thing like that? That doesn't go away here, but at least I have a little reference that I can now center my plane on, assuming the wind isn't too strong. Now, my next big tip for working in patterns is start slowing the plane down before you come to the point where you start your descent. Now, when you hit a beam, the numbers is normally when you have to start your good old 500 feet per minute descent and go ahead and pop in that first click of flaps. Now, if I look at my wing right now, you can see that I've got my click of flaps in, and I slowed down probably about a third to the end of the runway, about 1,000 feet to the end. And now I'm starting my descent down to the 45-degree point where I can actually engage in my turn here. Now, this plane is very aerodynamic, and it really likes to cruise here. So you can see this is my 45. I'm going to go ahead and turn. My next big tip is don't do any configuration changes in a turn. One of the things I used to do stupidly is I used to go ahead and now throw my flaps down, my electric flaps down, when I would be in my little base turn that I have here. Instead, come out of the base turn, then make the change. Because once you start doing 5 things at once, all that disruption of your flow is going to have a big impact on the overall stability of your approach here. Now, remember, when you drop those flaps, you're going to have to immediately start to reduce some speed here. Now, you can notice that as I make my turn onto final here, it's very tempting to slam in that last notch of flaps. But if you gave yourself enough space here, you should be able to bring them out very smoothly and then get yourself onto your final approach speed. Ideally, when you're going to be doing your approaches here, you want to be identifying kind of a point where you can have all your approach speeds set before you get to the ground, and everything else up to that point is basically going to be 5 to 10 knots a little high. Now, right now I'm looking at my window here. I can tell that my approach speed is a little on the high side for this aircraft. Altitude-wise, we basically got it perfect. When that occurs, it's just a matter of setting up the correct nose attitude and then just sort of fixing with your throttle to kind of control the descent rate of the plane. Now, I notice my plane it's a little nose high right now. We're getting a little fast, which usually means that we're a little high to begin with. So there's my speed. I'm right on speed, about 60 knots or so. We're We're going to come over the end of the runway. Now, once the runway is made, we're just going to smoothly pull the power back, level the plane off, and we're just going to transition into this slight nose up attitude, look down the runway, and just focus down the runway as you gently bring the nose down. If you start to drift, go ahead and put your aileron into the direction that you're nervous. Smoothly go ahead and pop up the controls and go ahead and give it full power. And now you just do this sucker many times. Remember, during takeoff, reset your trim. Reset your trim. In the flight sim, you're not going to notice that you're badly out of trim. In the real world, not being in trim is a nightmare when you do that configuration change. Now, one thing that I learned when I was flying patterns is the flaps don't always go up if you have electric flap aircraft and it's an older airplane. So make sure you confirm that before you put yourself in a situation where you're going to be turning. Now, once you get the basic shape of everything and things are looking pretty good for you and you're able to kind of bang those out reliably and safely, it's always a good time to go ahead and to practice slightly different things inside your pattern as you're working on it. Now, things like that, for example, would be the short approach. And the short approach is one of the highly recommended maneuvers to sort of learn how to control the energy of the airplane when you're in emergency sort of situations. Now, a lot of times when you're doing the short approach, this is one of those things that they're going to do for you on your BFR to make sure that you are still got what it takes kind of a thing. But the actual skill of the short approach is very useful because it's all about keeping your eye on and almost spending more time outside of the plane than inside of the plane. Now, if you remember, we have everything all squared up and ready to go before we attempt to do a short approach here. So go ahead and level off. We're a little low here. I'll give it just a little tiny power. My speed is very much under control. I'm not racing through the pattern here. I'm not pretending I'm a Cirrus. If I was a Cirrus anyway, I'd be out there in the ocean. I'm doing a straight-in approach. Who am I kidding? You can't turn a Cirrus. But the key thing that we have going on right here is we're just going to do now the short approach. Now, the short approach, the way you think about it is your goal is to get on the runway as soon as you possibly can. Pretend, for example, that your engine cut out on you and execute the maneuver the same way you always would, but just keep everything a lot closer. So we'll execute a short approach. I always recommend this all the time, every chance you get. Remember, you only crash if you don't have runway under you when the plane comes to a complete stop. Obviously, that's a gross oversimplification. Now, for me, when I'm doing the approaches, I always try to pick the end of the runway kind of as my aim point sort of a thing and use that as sort of my basis. So as I'm coming here on my very express base leg, we got a little bit too much energy here. We've got to pull this plane down. We'll go ahead and pop both notches of flaps in. If you find your nose at 5 or 6 degrees below the horizon, you probably are coming in pretty hot, and that means you can put all the flaps in. There's very few aircraft I've experienced where you don't dump the last bit of flaps in. So we'll go ahead and spin around here. I'm doing myself a nice little forward slip as we come around to runway 24. That looks pretty good to me. Let's go ahead and bring out of the slip. And we have just a little bit of extra speed here, so I'm going to hold it out of ground effect to slow down. Now we can start easing it down into the ground, and obviously we're going to do the commercial maneuver here, so we're going to go right on the 1,000 footers. Bonk. And again, once you're down on the ground, make sure you go ahead and put your aileron into the direction of the wind so that you have a nice smooth recovery. So when you do that and you become comfortable with those two kind of pieces, you're going to have a really successful time in the actual pattern. One more maneuver I would recommend trying too, as you're just kind of doing your little, I just want to kind of break in an airplane or, kind of do some kind of classic practice, is the rejected takeoff. Now, the reason I love this maneuver is because it gives you an opportunity to raise your blood pressure without killing you, usually, as long as you have enough runway. So we're going to go ripping down the runway. We're going to simulate an engine failure immediately following takeoff. And this is a great traffic pattern kind of practicing maneuver. The airplane goes up, the engine cuts off, let the nose drop, flare at the last possible second, keep the nose down, and we're just going to look down the end of the runway, and we're just going to settle back onto the ground. Don't forget you still have to fly the plane, so go ahead and deflect it that way. One of the things you have to watch out during that maneuver that we don't get in the sim, that we get here, is the fact that you're going to have a tremendous nose down tendency. It's going to feel like you're picking the airplane up with your left hand, kind of thing like that. So it acts as an excellent method. One more strategy you can do, while we're giving you all sorts of fun tips to do things in the traffic pattern to kind of shake it up a little bit, is to go ahead and do a rejected takeoff without getting in the air. Now, the fun thing with that is it becomes an excellent exercise in not blowing your tires out. And what I mean by that, of course, is that when you get very close, you start to lift the nose, and then the engine suddenly cuts out on you, you have to apply brakes. But what you have to do is maintain control of the plane. What a lot of people tend to do is just stand on the brakes. That's okay. Remember, you don't have a working engine anymore if you have this rejected takeoff situation. Now, if you're on fire, please stand on the brakes. If you're not on fire, remember this. You don't want to stop in the middle of the runway and now foul the runway with your broken airplane. Instead, it's almost worth it to use up a little bit extra room to be able to get yourself clear, so then you can worry about fouling up a taxiway rather than the entire runway itself. Enjoy.